Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with Legal Lines, and on our next show, I'm very pleased to have Tom Thorhill. He's a 26-year veteran, practicing attorney. He is the president of the Louisiana Trial Lawyers Association, and we're going to talk about what that association does and how it is involved in the political scene. We're also going to talk about trial lawyer bashing. Where did it come from, and is it true? So join us on the next Legal Lines with Mr. Tom Thorhill. Welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. I'm very pleased to have on the show Tom Thorhill. Tom has been a state legislator for 4 years. He is currently president of the Louisiana Trial Lawyers Association and been a practicing attorney for 26 years. Tom, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Locke. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. Give us a little personal history about yourself, educational background, what you've been doing.
Well, if you don't say you're from LSU these days, there's something
wrong. You're in trouble, that's right.
Yeah, LSU grad 2 times, undergraduate school and law school, and then the Greenway bug bit me a little bit as I studied petroleum engineering at Tulane some in the early years while I was practicing law, doing mostly then blowout and defense work.
Interesting.
A bad word, I guess, in the linguistics of those of us who are now primarily representing people who are individuals and seeking individuals' recoveries. But more recently, in my role as a legislator, I was able to see some of the things that truly needed to be addressed for individuals. It was an opportunity to recognize that different associations of folks, like the trial lawyers, have roles to play in government, and they have roles to play in our efforts to represent people for many, many years. Since the time I started practicing law 26 years ago, I'd been a member of the Trial Lawyers Association and active to some extent, but never really appreciated the role that it played in Louisiana politics. And it's not a role that some people would expect. It's not a power role. Unlike some of the moneyed interests, those interests with lots of money to give away, all the lawyers really have to offer through their association is a reflection on the truth of how the law, when enacted, might play out in society.
To educate the legislators.
It is.
About what's going to happen if you pass this thing.
It was particularly interesting to the legislators who were not lawyers, didn't have the years of grinding through the law books behind them, to have sort of an appreciation of how a law might be applied in society.
You know, the word lobbyist is sometimes used to describe what the association does, and I know it's not an accurate description, but those guys, those legislators, dealing with issues, all issues of society, and laws are regulating all issues, there's no way that they can possibly understand every segment, and that's what you're saying that the Trial Lawyers Association did.
It was that, and actually more than simply a matter of trying to grasp the depth of a particular piece of legislation. It was a matter of people serving in the position of legislator being asked to read and to digest over 5,000 pieces of legislation.
Impossible.
In less than a 60 or 90-day period, depending on the session. And so because they physically couldn't read everything more often than not, they turned to people who had an interest in the legislation and who were known to be what I like to call truth tellers. That is, they were people who would explain the position of their interest and oftentimes explain the position of people who were on the opposite side so that the legislator could understand it. And it is that role that our group, if you will, our association of lawyers fulfills. It's a very important role, and I didn't realize how important until I had occasion to serve.
Now, what would your staff do? You would be educated, or they would call it education, from the various different groups, and bottom line is you'd get kind of the opinion of each of the different interests that would be potentially affected by that legislation. And then what would your staff do? Would they try and synthesize that for you, do their own research? How did that work?
Truly, the people who serve in the legislature are blessed in that they have available to them some staff people who are lawyers to help offer explanations. But those explanations that are offered at the bottom of each bill, we lawyers refer to it as digests or comments, are a short synopsis of what the piece of legislation would offer. So if you have available to you someone who's astute enough as an associate lawyer, that person can make for you insightful comments that go beyond the very, very short comments or synopsis offered by the staff at the legislature. I was lucky enough to always hire someone who was a brand new lawyer, a lawyer who had just graduated from law school, to be my legislative assistant, and they then gave us additional input that we could offer. It's a benefit that can be offered through your staff, but it's not nearly as effective as half a dozen staff people, all of whom might be lawyers, serving through an association like ours, and having those people draw off the resources of thousands of us who are practicing lawyers and who can see tidbits of information that need to be shared about the prospective legislation. So whether it's you, Locke Meredith, or Bill Mitchell, one of your partners, or anybody else who has an idea to share, you can share it through this association, and it can ultimately be given to those who are trying
almost
to...
like a big funnel where you put all the information in, and then it comes out hopefully in an organized fashion that can be useful.
I like to think of it in terms of a family, you know, less mechanical, if you will, because the purpose of the association is to truly speak to the interest of those that we represent more often than not, and that's the persons who are doing the work on a day-to-day basis to make our society run. It's the workers, it's the individuals whose rights can't be advocated except for folks like you and me who are, if you will, advancing the cost and advancing the time and effort in hopes of somebody recovering, and knowing all the while that if we're unsuccessful, we don't get paid anything. Our client benefits because he's had his interest advocated. But unless, of course, the jury, the people who are the peers of our clients, decide favorably on their claim, there's no recovery.
Let's talk, we've kind of talked a little bit about what the Louisiana Trial Lawyers Association does. Let's talk about what a lawyer does. You kind of did. The bottom line is, if somebody comes in our offices and they're injured, more often than not, they don't have the resources to deal with not being able to work and pay their bills and go to the doctor and all the other problems that they're faced with, not to mention the cost to litigate.
That's right. You can't find a more compelling set of facts than somebody who is unable to work because he's been injured, who's unable to pay his medical bills because he's been injured, who's unable to provide for his family because he's been injured, and in many cases can't even pay his rent and his light bill because he's been injured. And where does he turn to for help? Well, he turns to somebody with a heart. I like to say that lawyers who represent plaintiffs these days ought to be renamed. Instead of trial lawyers, we ought to be called lawyers with a heart, because it's only those of us who are willing to risk our own efforts and our own cash flow toward the advancement of the cause of some individual that truly put it all on the line and do it with no assurance of recovery. And the only folks who would possibly do that would be lawyers like we plaintiffs' lawyers who represent individuals.
I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. That is what an attorney does on the next segment. I'm Locke Meredith with Legal Lines, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, very pleased to have Tom Thorhill. He's a practicing attorney for 26 years and is currently the president of the Louisiana Trial Lawyers Association. Tom, again, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're talking about kind of the role of the lawyer who represents injured folks and how he kind of puts it on the line if he believes in the person's cause, and we talked about how that's risky. Let's be a little more specific how it's risky.
It is important that folks realize that the function served by an individual who calls himself a plaintiff's advocate is somebody who's going to furnish sustenance for those people as they may need it in many forms.
Bottom line, money and
that's right.
What it takes to live.
Well, it's a number of different things. Obviously, it's money, and we tend to sometimes focus on that because that's the medium of exchange that all of us relate to day in and day out. But on the other hand, it's more than that. It's your secretary supporting somebody emotionally who is so distraught because they can't work, they can't provide for their family, they can't meet their basic needs day to day, And those people turn to you, Locke Meredith, and your firm to support themselves emotionally as well as financially, and of course their cause for recompense, for compensation alone, just to be made whole as a result of the wrongdoing of the person on the other side, is never met without your advancing your time, the interest of your firm in furnishing costs and fees, and seeing that the person's case is fully advocated. Many times it involves hiring experts,
which costs thousands of dollars.
Who are the only people that can possibly begin to address the specific complex machinery that was encountered, or the specific complex facts that caused for an occurrence. And without people like you, Locke, doing that, I must tell you that I don't think that the individuals who are represented today would be fully represented. Can you imagine what would happen if somebody couldn't hire an expert, if they couldn't pay the filing fee?
They'd never have their day in court.
That's right.
Bottom line is a summary judgment would be filed by the other side, and they'd say they can't prove what they're alleging, and they're out.
It's that very system of making sure that the interests of our clients are fully advocated that makes for the association that we now call the Trial Lawyers Association. I know you've heard me say that I'd really like to rename it because it is a group of lawyers with a heart speaking to the individual's interests.
And what's interesting is we've kind of talked about the involvement at the legislative side, but it is a resource to lawyers who represent injured folks that is just second to none, because it gives you access to all kinds of other information and research and depositions of experts and just limitless information that is useful to the attorney representing that injured person to do a good job.
Oh, and how we know that, don't we? We've seen it
with
so many cases where major manufacturers would intentionally pollute our water or our air or produce defective products. But for you sharing with me information that you collected when you deposed the president of that company or the engineer at that company, and it turns out that they knew for many, many years of the risk of harm to others, but they chose not to fix it because it was less costly for them to pay for damage claims than it was for them to retool their machinery.
It's basically an economic equation.
That's right.
And what we're talking about is enabling the injured person who doesn't have the resources to take on, if necessary, if they're the culprit, multi-million-dollar companies and corporations and entities. But for there being someone willing to stick their neck out in terms of money and time and energy and effort, emotional, mental, I mean, it is tremendously mentally and emotionally trying on an individual when they basically love and become friends with their clients to go try a case.
It truly is, and you know this because you've tried many cases to juries. But it is amazing to me to watch the system work. The system that we have works because there are individuals like you, Locke, who are willing to put themselves out on the line, but more importantly, to truly represent the interest of those who are injured, those who need someone to speak for them, because they can't speak for themselves. They can't pay thousands of dollars for depositions to make sure that these particular issues are fully explored and then properly represented in a jury system.
We've kind of talked about what lawyers do on this side. Let's talk about how in the world we've got to the point where you drive down the interstate and you see a billboard that says, "Beware of trial lawyer candidates," and, guys running for certain races just bashing trial lawyers. How did we get here? I mean, I know there are bad apples in every profession, and we've got ours, but the bottom line is that doesn't represent all of us. And I'm trying to figure out, how did we get here?
It's a good question. It's one that I asked myself when I was serving in state government as a legislator. And I began to research that. And it was very insightful to learn that the whole concept of modifying our tort system came from the effort of the tobacco companies to avoid these huge verdicts that they knew were coming if people found out what they were doing.
Which is what's gone down.
And ultimately, the states themselves found out that the tobacco companies were putting addictive drugs in their product to make people to continue to use them. And it led to the states, through their attorneys general, focusing on first filing suits and ultimately making for some form of recompense to the states themselves.
Richard Iob has been in here on the show and talked about it. I think it was $50 million. I've forgotten how. It was a tremendously huge number.
Yeah, well, for Louisiana, it was over $4 billion.
Jeez, man.
And that amount was arrived at because of the cost of our having to provide free medical services to the people who are injured by that addictive drug and tobacco product. But the whole concept of those people trying to avoid those huge verdicts is one that took shape in 1985 through what we call a special interest lobbying group, or a group of people who are hired as professionals to put a spin on the issues so that hopefully they could twist things and turn them and make people who would serve on juries not understand the issue. And so that money began to be spent in ads, and rather than speak to the issue, the memos that we've now discovered in the tobacco litigation show that it was consciously and intentionally undertaken by those who are officers and directors in the tobacco companies to spin against lawyers who represent plaintiffs and to give them a bad name and to say, rather than we know that we've been polluting products, we've been putting addictive drugs in them, and we're wrong, and we know that we owe you for a full recompense, individuals who consumed our products. Let's instead try to distort this issue. And the way we're going to do it, the memos from these tobacco companies.
You're not making this up. You've seen the documentation sign off by those guys.
Fully discovered in the tobacco case that you mentioned. Richard Iob brought it for Louisiana. That documentation says that we're going to attack the lawyers who represent the claimants. And we're going to say that they're greedy. We're going to call them greedy lawyers for bringing claims against us. And we're not going to talk about the issues. We're never going to say anything about tobacco and pollution and addictive drugs. We're just going to talk about that. And that's how it all got started.
Well, it's amazing. Let's follow up on that on the next segment. Let's talk about the recent races and what lawyers do that is good.
Sounds interesting.
Legal Lines with Locke Meredith. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, very pleased to have on the show Tom Thorhill. Tom is a 26-year veteran of practicing law and is currently the president of the Louisiana Trial Lawyers Association. Again, thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me.
We were talking about how the trial lawyer bashing has been taking place and kind of the origin of it being the tobacco companies, because they knew they were getting ready to get sued and they were wrong, and they're trying to figure out how to dodge that bullet, and so they start saying, let's trash lawyers and maybe the juries will be biased and they just won't really listen to the facts.
It did start with them in 1985, and as I mentioned to you in the last program, there was discovered in that tobacco litigation the very memo of those who conspired to make for this false message. And into that theme bought chemical companies and then insurance companies. And they have formed a coalition. In fact, the idea of bashing the representatives, the advocates of those who might make claims, has become popular with the U.S. Chambers of Commerce. And you may have seen reported in the Forbes article that was released in July of this very year that the U.S. Chambers of Commerce has decided that they're going to continue to attack advocates for plaintiffs, which they call trial lawyers, by spending $100 million in campaigns of candidates this year to say that those who might be potential representatives of individuals are aligned with the interest of trial lawyers.
Just amazing.
To think that someone would spend that kind of money
for
the sole purpose of trying to avoid claims and distort the image of the claimant, the individual who's been injured, who's lost his arm or his leg, or whose mother or dad has been killed, all for the sake of profit or greed, goes beyond most of our imagination. But the truth of the matter is that just as we've seen in so many of the corporate scandals recently, where people cook the books and they fraudulently present their company just for the sake of making a few extra dollars on each share of stock, when multiplied by millions of shares of stock, makes for millions and millions of dollars, and that's why they do it. They've begun now to be hauled off in chains to you see it on television. They handcuff the presidents and the chief operating officers of many of our major companies and ship them off to jail because of their fraud. Well, this scheme to distort the whole image of those who advocate for poor people and individuals who have claims is a scheme that originated with those same kind of folks. We've discovered it, and the good thing about it is the message is beginning to get out.
Well, and it happened, there was seemed to me, significant amount of trial lawyer bashing going on in the governor's race a little bit, and then in the local races, and those folks didn't seem to fare very well.
Well, most of the people are now beginning to see behind the scenes. It always amazes me to talk about easy cases and easy things, but when you look at the facts, it's hard to distort the facts when they really come out. If your office, Locke, were to serve to everybody who came in a product that was going to injure them. For instance, let's say instead of you serving me coffee today, you gave me boiling hot water that you knew was going to burn my mouth and burn the inside of my stomach, and if it spilled on me, it would be so hot it would burn me. And if your office did that, Locke, 700 times, you would obviously know it. And if you had someone say to you, well, that's the way we market the product and make it more appealing because it stays hot longer, and you weren't worried about the risk of injury or the risk of loss to the person who consumed, and despite the fact they might sue you, you knew that might be less than the money you could make on serving that very hot product. Well, that presents a factual scenario that most folks who have heard about the McDonald's case never heard.
And that's what it was.
And it was, in fact, that which led the jury of the peers of those who were involved to say that this is so wrong, we should punish these people. We should make them pay punitive damages. Something we don't have in Louisiana, incidentally.
No more.
But generally speaking, it is that motivation to see that the truth comes out that makes for folks like you and me and the Trial Lawyers Association, the lawyers with a heart, as I like to say, speaking to what the facts are and letting folks know that there's just no reason to be offended at the fact that you or me might come and represent individuals who've lost their arm or their leg or their loved one, because they're just there to try to speak to the issues and ask to be made whole.
Let's talk about the jury system real quick. I mean, I find that it works.
It does.
Nothing's perfect, and that's why we have the appellate courts up there, but the bottom line is they hear the facts and they apply the law, and they do it very well.
You probably recall, if you reach back in your memory to when you were learning about American history, that there was a guy by the name of Ben Franklin who was involved in the formation of our government as we know it. And it was him who said that more important than the right to vote is the right to have independent juries. And that means people who are our peers sitting on juries and able to decide the facts as they are presented to them, whether it's deciding that someone is a criminal and he needs to go to jail, as they do, deciding life or death for that criminal defendant, or deciding whether somebody should be fully paid, fully compensated for the injury or loss that they've suffered. Those juries need to be independent. And it's what I like to say is the very microcosm of all that we hold dear when we say that we are going to be a people, a government that reflects interests of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's what the jury does.
That's right. And what the big guys, the defendants who we've talked about who want to manipulate the system, they want to try and remove independence from the judiciary system, whether it's political appointment of judges or higher thresholds to have a jury or lower thresholds to have a jury, or remove the jury system entirely.
It is truly becoming well known now that those who are trying to distort the facts in cases, put different spins on them, and advertise them as if they didn't exist, and who are most afraid of jury verdicts, want to put caps on the rights of juries to decide whether your mother, your father, or your child is entitled to full compensation. All those people trying to do those things have a common motivation. They're trying to save profits for themselves. So they care more about their profits than they care about the individuals who are injured. It's that very thing that's coming out in the political scenarios, one after another, whether it's a local race or it's a statewide race. And people are just not buying it anymore. They're not buying it in Louisiana, and they're going to also be seen not to buy it in races across America as we see them happening in the fall. The truth bubbles to the top always.
Well, and the pendulum has kind of been swung pretty far over for a while. I've seen a lot of rights that folks had go away. Insolito liability,
Yes.
and so many others. And I'm curious, what is your take real quick on the change in the governor?
I think Kathleen Blanco is an excellent choice. I supported her. I think that she is an individual who will speak to the interests of individuals. She knows people. She's always been open-minded and receptive. I don't see her as being anywhere else than right in the middle and a moderate. And I expect Louisiana to benefit from her leadership. She's someone who has a heart, like us lawyers.
I do too. Tom, thank you so much for being
Good.
on the show.
Thank you so
We'll get you
much
back
for
in
having
soon.
me.
I'm Locke Meredith for Legal Lines. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next time.